Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have the journalist Beth Shelburne. She's out of Alabama, and she's been working on the case of Toforest Johnson, who has been on death row in Alabama since 1998 for a 1995 murder of a sheriff's deputy. So, welcome to the show, Beth.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Hello from a very hot and muggy Birmingham, Alabama.
And we're in a very hot and dry California, but all heat is hot. So how did you find out about the case of Toforest Johnson?
I was working as a television news reporter. I did that for about 20 years before I became an independent journalist that made podcasts and wrote about prisons. But I was working for the largest TV station in the state, WBRC, in Birmingham, and we heard about a case. This is in 2019, a death row case that was going to be back in court and on appeal. I didn't know anything about Toforest Johnson or the crime that he was convicted in. I wasn't living in Birmingham when the crime occurred. We just thought that it sounded like an interesting story to cover because I did a lot of stories that were criminal justice related. Because he had been on death row at that point for around 20 years, and we learned from his advocates that he had proclaimed innocence the whole time he'd been locked up, and that he had successfully convinced a judge to take a look at this claim in his appeals, a claim of prosecutorial misconduct in his trial. And so I was assigned to cover that hearing in 2019. And that's how this whole process began. And I've been covering it ever since.
So tell us a bit about the case itself.
Yeah, Toforest was convicted, as you mentioned, in the 1995 murder of a sheriff's deputy in Birmingham. And there were 4 trials in this case, 2 defendants. He had a co-defendant who was also tried twice but was acquitted at his second trial. Toforest and his co-defendant in their first trials both ended in hung juries. And then the result was Toforest was convicted. His co-defendant was acquitted. The crime was one of those whodunits from the very beginning. There were no eyewitnesses to the murder. This was a sheriff's deputy who was moonlighting as a security guard at a local hotel. The hotel is in a suburb just south of Birmingham that is not known for a lot of criminal activity. It's mainly a business hotel. It's an Embassy Suites now. At the time, it was called the Crown Sterling Suites, but a mid-range business hotel, not a drug dealing type establishment. The victim in the case was working the overnight shift as a security guard, and for some reason got up from the middle atrium of the hotel and went out the back door to the parking lot, where he was shot at close range in the head twice. This happened between midnight and 1 a.m. Most of the people inside the hotel were asleep. A few guests heard the shots and went to the window and saw one individual get into a car and drive away. But that was pretty much it. So cops had very little to go on, and tremendous pressure, as you can imagine, to solve this case and to bring it to a conclusion, because this deputy sheriff was a well-liked member of the community. There was no clear motive or reason that anyone could jump to where he would, that would give somebody a reason to kill him. And so there was very little evidence to go on, but tremendous pressure on police. And that was the dynamic that led to the arrests of 6 different people initially for the murder, based on a tip from a 15-year-old girl who changed her story hundreds of times. So that's how the investigation started, and it evolved over the 2 years preceding the trials. It evolved tremendously. So the reason that the podcast is called Earwitness is because the only evidence the state used to convict Toforest Johnson and to connect him to the murder was the testimony of an ear witness. There was no physical evidence that they could use to connect him to the murder. Toforest Johnson has always had an alibi, the same alibi with 10 different witnesses. So this was a circumstantial case predicated on the testimony of a single person who was not an eyewitness, but an ear witness, a woman who claimed to overhear someone talking about the murder on a phone call, someone that she said was Toforest Johnson.
And how does she connect that conversation to Forrest Johnson?
The story, one of the reasons I wanted to do a podcast to unpack this whole case is because some of these details get kind of fiddly and confusing. The 15-year-old initial witness that I mentioned is not the ultimate ear witness that takes the stand and testifies against Toforest Johnson. The ear witness was a middle-aged woman who came forward 3 weeks after the murder and told police that she had eavesdropped on some jailhouse phone calls and heard someone who identified themselves as Toforest Johnson talking about the crime. Initially, police did not believe her because she is not mentioned in the 2 years leading up to the trial, including at the grand jury hearings. This ear witness and what she claimed, the theory that her version of what she overheard seems to support, is not presented to the grand jury. It's only when the testimony of this 15-year-old witness starts to fall apart that the state begins to rely on this ear witness, and she's called as the star witness in the case against Toforest Johnson.
Have you ever talked to her?
I have. I went and knocked on her door in 2020 when I was writing about the case and had a brief conversation with her on the front porch of her house. She's elderly now and was sort of all over the place and how she feels about her involvement in this case, but at the end of the day is still sticking by what she claims she overheard, and says that she's certain she heard this person talk about the murder all these years later, but she can't be certain that it was him because she didn't know Toforest Johnson and had never heard his voice. So there's a lot of inconsistencies in what she claims. After that initial conversation with her during the reporting for the podcast, myself and my producer went back to her house multiple times and she would not speak with us.
And did you ever talk to any of the jurors on the case where he was convicted? Because it seems like this evidence is pretty thin, even as these things go. And I've covered quite a few wrongful conviction cases.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people say this is about the worst circumstantial evidence they've ever heard, the flimsiest evidence to send someone to death row. Yes, I have spoken with 3 jurors since that 2019 hearing, my official entrance into covering Toforest Johnson's case. And the jurors wanted to speak to me after the information that came to light in that hearing was covered by myself and other reporters and started to ripple out into the world. And that information was that this ear witness, the woman who claimed she overheard Toforest Johnson confess to the murder, was paid a $5,000 reward by the state, and that was not disclosed to the jury. It was not disclosed to Toforest Johnson. And in fact, the state hid that information for 17 years until they finally produced the documents supporting this reward payment and claimed that they had been misfiled. The jurors were completely incensed that this information was not given to them at trial, and all of them said in their own way that it would have changed how they viewed this key witness and her credibility. One of the jurors is her voice is in the podcast, and we do a pretty extensive interview with her. It was interesting to talk to them, 20 plus years after the fact. Memory is tricky, and a lot of the details about what went on in the jury room during deliberations are lost. But it was interesting that none of these three jurors, all of whom are white, could really put their finger on what exactly it was that made them vote for guilt, except that they believed this witness at the time. I think what was unspoken in those interviews with jurors, and is kind of an undercurrent here, is this presumption of guilt that accompanies many young Black men that are put on trial for crimes. It's that thing that even 20 plus years later, with all of their regrets, these jurors still couldn't really put their fingers on, but I felt like was there.
And again, this is in the mid to late 90s. So, right. So we're talking, 25, 30 years ago.
Yes, the age of the super predator, coming out of crack cocaine epidemic across the country, and this real lock them up and throw away the key mindset in our criminal justice system, particularly when it comes to young Black men.
So let's talk about 2019 now. What does the judge hear, and why does the judge ultimately rule against him?
The judge really hears from Toforest Johnson and his attorneys all of the evidence supporting this $5,000 reward payment, which was really a set of documents that they had only recently obtained. And, the argument that this amounts to a Brady violation because paying a witness is a mitigating factor that must be disclosed to the other side, and it wasn't. The judge ultimately rules in the state's favor and against Toforest Johnson. And Judge Teresa Pulliam has not spoken to me on the record about this case, and she has since retired. But from what I can glean reading her opinion is that she agreed with the state that this wasn't a secret reward payment, that the reward wasn't discussed before the trial, and that there was no agreement that she would be paid after the trial. They claim that 3 years after Toforest Johnson was convicted and lost his direct appeal, they spontaneously called up Violet Ellison, the ear witness, and said, come on down to the courthouse and collect your $5,000. The judge bought that story, and she also wrote that she found Violet Ellison credible, based on a number of factors, including that she was well-dressed and articulate. So, you can read between the lines of what's kind of currency is going on there. But there were a number of factors presented by Toforest Johnson's team that question the credibility of Violet Ellison. The fact that she knew the victim in this case, Deputy Bill Hardy, and his wife, and was personally invested in monitoring all of the coverage of the case. Most of it included that there was a reward for information that led to arrest and conviction. She maintains that she didn't know that. She didn't know that there was any money on the table, and she came forward simply because she was a concerned citizen. They really tried to impeach that, and I think they did it very well. Violet Ellison, the ear witness, was also in a lot of financial trouble at the time. Her husband and her had filed for bankruptcy. So there was a lot to support the notion that she would come forward. She would have reasons to come forward for money. But the judge ultimately disagreed. And the judge, who's a former prosecutor, denied that it was prosecutorial misconduct.
Yeah, it's just interesting listening to your account here, because almost everything here is kind of typical, and yet this case is extreme at the same time. And so, like, every little thing that you brought up is not really unusual. You often see judges bending over backwards to maintain the conviction, but at the same time, you know, the thinness of the evidence just is so stark here.
Let me just tell you the most dramatic example of that, of this judge bending over backwards to support her own belief that this wasn't prosecutorial misconduct. In the documents presented by Toforest Johnson's attorneys, it actually says, written by the DA at the time, that this witness needs to be compensated because she came forward in pursuit of the reward money. It's written into the documents, and the judge dismissed that openly in court, saying, oh, well, that's just a form letter. Oh, well, that's just the protocol. That's just the boilerplate language that they have to use.
So what happens from here? And I'm also curious because Alabama, you know, generally is fairly quick as these things go to execute people, how he's managed to not be executed at this point.
Well, he still has several active appeals, and he has a very good legal team. So I think that makes a big difference on, you know, who gets killed and who lives for a long time on Alabama's death row. Where things stand right now, Toforest Johnson is trying to get back into Jefferson County Court to continue to talk about this ear witness and some of the credibility issues that she has. It remains to be seen whether or not this new judge who replaced the old one will grant another evidentiary hearing. They're very hopeful that that will happen, perhaps early next year, but we'll have to wait and see. He also has some appeals in federal court. So, you know, legally speaking, I think he has, you know, a couple more years, but as you and your listeners probably know, that's not very much time when you're on death row. There's growing advocacy supporting him. Many people, some in positions of power, coming forward to agree not only that he may be innocent, but at the very least deserves a new trial. We have now a former attorney general of the state of Alabama, several former prosecutors or retired prosecutors. The original prosecutor who sent Toforest Johnson to death row now supports a new trial and has gone on the record saying that. So that's sort of where things stand
That's
right
pretty
now.
interesting too.
It is, yeah.
Have you talked to him?
I spoke to him at length in the podcast. His name is Jeff Wallace, and it was an incredibly insightful set of interviews that we did on, gosh, the difficulties that prosecutors have in expressing doubt about their own work and the cases that they have worked on, how there's really not a framework or space available for them to be part of these conversations. The default is always just defend the conviction, defend the conviction. So when you actually break from that, the bar is just so low. Even the fact that he is supporting a new trial publicly is extraordinary. He hasn't gone so far as to say he thinks he did anything wrong, or that there are illegal parts of this case or anything like that, but he believes that there should be a new trial. The thing that's most extraordinary about where Toforest Johnson's case is now, at least to me, is that you have these positions of power that are taking polar opposite views of this case. On the one side, you have the current district attorney who has reviewed the case and filed an actual motion in court asking for a new trial with the support of Jeff Wallace, the original trial prosecutor. And then on the other side, you have Alabama's attorney general, who represents the state in all capital cases, who is still seeking Toforest Johnson's execution and not hearing any of these petitions for a new trial, completely ignoring all of these reasons that this man, at the very least, deserves a new trial, but in my opinion and many others, deserves to be let out of prison yesterday.
Right. What, from your perspective, are you most surprised about having gone through all of this?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. I was born and raised in Alabama, and I had been working as a journalist back in my home state since 2010 when I started covering this case. So many things about it didn't surprise me because I sort of already knew how screwed up the system is, how racism is just baked in at almost every level, and how if you are poor, you are screwed, but particularly if you're Black and poor, you're really screwed in this ecosystem. I think what still surprises me the most is that he is still on death row and that there is still an entire machinery of death working to kill him, despite the fact that there is clear and convincing evidence, a mountain high, of his innocence. And yet they just cannot be swayed. And it's really terrifying. And I can't really explain it. People have asked me, what is going on? Is it politics? Is it racism? Is it like, why is the state so hell-bent? And I don't know all of those dynamics, and I still haven't been able to put words to them. But it's something really deep and sinister.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I cover a lot of these cases the same way. I've been thinking about the Richard Glossip case as you've been talking out of Oklahoma, because in that case, you have the attorney general actually trying to get the guy out, and he can't get the guy out.
Right.
So, I mean, there is some weird is probably the new word of the year, right? But there's some weirdness going on in the criminal justice system that it's that hard to get these people out when the evidence is flimsy. There's really strong evidence of innocence, and yet you still can't get them out or even get them off death row in many cases.
Yeah, or even slow down the march to the execution chamber. I mean, it's you're right. This tension between all of these forces that determine whether someone lives or dies is really not about the truth. It can't be. It's not. It's proving that it's not. I think the other thing that has surprised me, and David, this may not surprise your listeners, but it still shocks me today. And I think it shocked many listeners that a person can end up being convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death based on the word of one paid witness. That was sort of how this story was pitched to me at the very beginning, way back when in 2019. And honestly, I wasn't sure that I believed it. His family told me that, his attorneys, and I thought, no, there's got to be something else that they have on this guy, because I really don't think that you would end up on death row. And, from my mouth to God's ears, like that's how he ended up on death row. And that really kind of shattered the last thing I think I was clinging to, that maybe our system isn't that bad. Yep, it's that bad.
And, I hate to say it, but I'm not surprised. I mean, I've seen a lot of cases where people are on death row because of even worse, a jailhouse informant who's given leniency, and that's the sole word. Now, in California, at least, and in some other states, they can no longer convict somebody just on the word of an informant like that. But, in most places that hasn't happened yet. But we know from, all the Innocence Project's files and the registry of exonerations, how many people have actually been placed on death row and convicted based on solely on the testimony of an eyewitness who has an obvious bias.
Yeah, I think that when death penalty supporters hear about these cases, it's a chance for them to, if they're willing to listen, to really pause and interrogate their own belief that capital punishment is necessary. Because a lot of people assume, oh, well, all those people, there's tons of forensic evidence and DNA, and they wouldn't be there if the state wasn't 100% sure. Then when they hear, and I've had conservatives in Alabama tell me they were absolutely shocked when they listened to the podcast and heard all of the missteps and this tiny thin reed of quote unquote evidence that sent him to death row. I think it's a chance to tell death penalty stalwarts the truth about our system. And it's not just involving capital cases. I mean, many people in prison serving long sentences are there on circumstantial cases. And I'm not saying there's hundreds of thousands of wrongful convictions, but there's many people that are over convicted, that are convicted of charges upon charges that were stacked up by prosecutors and argued using circumstantial evidence or half-baked stuff. And once you start pulling the straws out, it's very easy to feel like the whole house comes falling down.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I've always been an opponent of capital punishment, but, in the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years since I've learned all this stuff, it's only solidified my view because of how flawed the criminal justice system is and how easy it is to convict somebody on very flimsy evidence, and then how hard it is to undo that. And that part is the most mind-boggling. And I think, if people are honest And if somebody honestly believes that we should have the death penalty, which there are people like that, they would want to ensure that the people that are actually getting executed are actually guilty.
Right. That's true. And, one of the biggest supporters of Toforest Johnson's innocence is a death penalty stalwart, a former attorney general in Alabama who still to this day is a defender of the death penalty. But he reviewed Toforest Johnson's case and was aghast and has written an op-ed in the Washington Post and really put himself out there. His name is Bill Baxley, advocating for Toforest Johnson, which is not something that Bill Baxley has ever done, in his 60 plus years of practicing law, many of them as a prosecutor. He's never advocated for anybody's release until now. So that's how egregious this case is.
And we're almost out of time, but I did want to bring in one other angle, that this case has started to attract attention from celebrities, and so it's become kind of a cause celeb. Kim Kardashian, for instance, has posted about the case on her Instagram.
Yeah, that has been a big boost for Toforest. I understand from his family members, who have told him all this. He's very grateful that people are hearing his side of this story and hearing the truth. I think it gives him and his family a lot of hope that the right thing will ultimately end up happening. In this case, I mean, if we're talking realistically, we know that, Kim Kardashian is not the Attorney General of Alabama. And, it remains to be seen how influential voices like hers are and what ultimately happens. But that's been really gratifying. And, there have been many people behind the scenes that have come to know Toforest's story through hearing the podcast Earwitness. And I think his supporters list is growing every day. And, you never know what kind of difference that's going to make. But I think him and his legal team and all the people that support him are in agreement that we have to just keep doing it, because he's still alive and there's still a chance to save him.
And so as we wrap up here, how can people listen to the podcast, Earwitness?
So it's available on all major podcast platforms. You just search for Earwitness. It's 8 parts, and you will be outraged. I feel like it should come with a trigger warning because the case is so outrageous. One thing that makes this series a little different is we actually got access, as I mentioned, to the original trial prosecutor and the original homicide detective. And so it's quite revealing in pulling back the curtain and seeing how these kinds of cases happen, like watching a slow motion train wreck. So just search Earwitness and you'll find it.
Is there a book in the works?
Well, not so far, but I am continuing to report on Toforest's case. I'm hoping that there will be some upcoming episodes for the podcast so we can refresh the series with what's going on. And maybe there'll be a season 2 when he gets out and he can, tell us about his whole journey of living on death row as an innocent person, because he's got quite a story to tell.
Well, thanks so much for coming on and sharing this amazing story that unfortunately I think is all too common.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate it.
We've been talking with Beth Shelburne, and she's been covering for years now the Toforest Johnson case. He's currently on death row and has credible claims of innocence. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com.